Hey guys, tonight we're going to take a very slow, very calm stroll into the strange world of medieval gossip punishments. So, dim the lights, get comfortable, and maybe sip some tea. Because nothing says relaxing bedtime story quite like people being strapped into iron masks for talking too much. And yes, that was a thing. A whole thing, you see. Back in the days when soap was rare, shoes were optional, and dental care was mostly just prayer, gossip was treated as more than just an annoying habit. It was a genuine community problem. People worried about it the way we worry about, online misinformation or spam emails. Except their solution wasn't fact checkers. Their solution was to publicly humiliate you in front of your neighbors while making sure you looked absolutely ridiculous in the process. So tonight, we're going to wander slowly through the village square, peeking at some of the favorite tools and traditions used to keep mouths shut. From scolds' bridles to ducking stools, from shame parades to the good old-fashioned stocks, we'll float gently across the centuries, listening to the strange ways medieval communities tried to manage small-town chatter. Let's start with the basics. What did gossip even mean in a medieval context? Because today, gossip is, your co-worker whispering that Karen is dating the new guy from IT. But in a world without social media, gossip was a little bit more structural. Villages relied on word of mouth for everything. Who was selling? Grain. Who was cheating at market weights? Who was seen sneaking into the barn with someone else's husband? If your neighbor's roof caught fire, you found out because somebody shouted it down the lane, not because of a notification on your phone. So gossip wasn't just entertainment. It was news, it was rumor, it was scandal, and it was also the glue that held social order together, which is exactly why it was so dangerous. Talk too much, and suddenly reputations collapse, markets fail, and marriages end. In a tiny community of maybe 200 souls, that was the kind of disruption people didn't forgive easily. And who, historically, got accused of gossiping the most? Women, of course, because patriarchy never misses a chance. Men's heated. Arguments were framed as politics or debate. Women's conversations were branded as scolding or nagging, which meant that when punishments for gossip were devised, they were overwhelmingly directed at women, especially those who were older, poorer, or just generally not considered charming by their neighbors. All right, so picture yourself in a muddy, little English village around the year 1500. Timber-framed houses, smoke drifting from thatched roofs, pigs wandering in the street. And in the square, there's a woman wearing something that looks suspiciously like an iron birdcage strapped to her face. That would be the scold's bridle, or sometimes just the branks. This delightful invention was essentially a metal mask with a built-in gag, often a flat plate or spike that pressed down on the tongue. The idea was simple. If you can't keep your mouth shut, we'll make sure you literally can't use it. Some of these contraptions even had bells on top, so when you were marched around town, everyone could hear the jingle-jangle of your shame approaching. Because humiliation works best with a soundtrack. Now, were these used constantly? No, they were too expensive to be common in every hamlet. But when they did appear, they made an impression. Imagine sitting at your spinning wheel, minding your own business, and hearing the bell ring outside. You peek through the shutters, and there's your neighbor Margaret, stomping through the mud, head caged in iron, escorted by the constable. And you think to yourself, right, maybe I won't tell anyone about John's missing chickens after all. And speaking of chickens, medieval punishments loved to borrow from farm life. Which brings us to the ducking stool. If the bridle was about silence, the ducking stool was about cleansing. Not cleansing in the spiritual sense. Cleansing in the sense of dunking someone repeatedly into a cold river until they stopped being annoying. The setup was simple. A sturdy wooden chair fixed to a long beam, mounted on a pivot. The scold, or supposed gossip, would be strapped in, then swung out over the local pond or river and dunked headfirst into the water. Again, and again, and again. Communities used this not just for gossipers, but also for so-called disorderly women, common scolds, or honestly anyone the neighbors were tired of hearing. Sometimes even men got the treatment, though that was less common. But either way, it was a form of public entertainment. People would gather to watch, laugh, and occasionally shout advice, as if the whole thing was some kind of twisted village sport. And here's the ironic part. Ducking was supposed to cool the temper of a hot-headed gossiper, as if hypothermia was the cure for a sharp tongue. But in reality, it was humiliating, dangerous, and sometimes even fatal. Rivers in England were not exactly spa quality. If you didn't drown, you might still come out with pneumonia, which, in medieval terms, was basically a death sentence anyway. So, the message was clear. Keep your words to yourself, or the river will hear them next. Now, not every community could afford fancy ironwork or complicated dunking machinery. Sometimes, the punishments were more DIY, like the cucking stool. This was basically just a wooden chair set up in the town square, where you'd be strapped in and displayed like an unwanted centerpiece. Instead of water, the idea here was ridicule. People might jeer, throw garbage, or just point and laugh, until the offender sat there long enough to feel properly humiliated. It's worth noting that these punishments were almost never about justice in the modern sense. Nobody thought the ducking stool was going to reform a person into becoming a model citizen. These were about control. They reinforced social order, silenced dissent, and reminded everyone else who was watching. Don't step out of line. Let's float over to another medieval favorite, the public shaming parade. Sometimes, if someone was accused of scolding, gossiping, or just being too loud for the village's taste, they'd be forced to walk through the streets wearing some sort of ridiculous costume. Maybe a paper crown, maybe a signboard around their neck that said, "Scold," maybe dragging a heavy object as a symbol of their burden. You know, because nothing calms down an outspoken woman like making her cosplay as the town fool for a day. And this wasn't just England. All across Europe, different regions had their own variations. In Germany, for instance, you had the Schandmaske, literally a shame mask. These were iron or leather masks shaped into grotesque faces, sometimes with animal features. One might have a pig snout, another a long tongue sticking out, another exaggerated donkey ears. The symbolism was blunt. You're being an animal, so now you look like one. It's kind of funny, in a dark way. The whole community spends hours forging an elaborate mask, fitting it with horns or a lolling tongue, then parading someone around in it, all to make sure she doesn't say anything mean at the market. It's like using a cannon to kill a mosquito. But of course, all of this humiliation required an audience. Punishments were staged to be seen, which meant that gossip itself became theater. People would rush to the square, eager to watch the latest shaming, trading their own whispers as they did so. Did you hear what she said about the miller's wife? Well, I heard she cursed the parson's cow. And in that way, punishing gossip actually created more gossip, which is, if you think about it, very on brand for humanity. Let's pause and drift a little here. Imagine being in one of these villages at night, after the day's chores are done. The fire is low, the animals are quiet, and you can hear neighbors murmuring through the thin walls. Maybe someone's whispering about how cruel the constable was at the ducking today. Maybe someone else is complaining that Margaret's bridal bells kept the baby awake. Gossip was constant, unstoppable, and woven into daily life. Punishments didn't end it. They just turned it into a spectacle. And honestly, people have always loved a spectacle. We binge Netflix now. They had Margaret in the ducking chair. Different tools, same instinct. All right. So we've gotten comfortable with the basics. Iron masks, ducking chairs, and the occasional parade of embarrassment. But of course, medieval Europe was never satisfied with just one way to humiliate people. The imagination, when fueled by boredom, piety, and a little casual misogyny, can go to some interesting places. So let's take a little wander, slowly, calmly, no rush, into some of the other creative traditions villages used to silence gossip, nagging, or just people they didn't particularly like. First stop, Charivari. Charivari was, essentially, a noise parade, a kind of folk punishment. Imagine it's midnight. You're tucked into your straw mattress, finally asleep after a long day of hauling buckets of water, spinning wool, or yelling at your chickens. And suddenly, bang, clang, screech. The whole neighborhood explodes in sound. Pots are being banged. Pans are clattered. Horns blown. Songs shouted badly on purpose. It's like your neighbors have all decided to form the world's worst heavy metal band right outside your window. And who was the target of this midnight concert? Often newlyweds who the community disapproved of. Maybe the groom was too old. Maybe the bride was too young. Maybe the couple had skipped the proper church blessing. Or, in some cases, it was directed at quarrelsome households where the wife was thought to be too domineering. In other words, if people thought you were gossiping, nagging, or generally stepping outside your lane, they could subject you to a personalized village concert of shame. Now, Charivari wasn't just for women. Men could get it too, particularly if they were seen as weak, henpecked, or generally failing in their manly duties. Which tells you everything you need to know about how medieval communities defined gender. Everybody had a role. Step outside of it, and here comes the banging pan brigade. What's fascinating is that Charivari wasn't a state punishment. It wasn't ordered by a court. It was community-driven, a sort of grassroots policing of behavior, which makes it feel almost modern in a way, like this was the medieval equivalent of cancel culture. Except instead of mean tweets, you got 15 neighbors outside your house, blowing horns until you cried uncle. Let's drift gently now toward another favorite, the shame flute. Yes, that's a real thing. A shame flute, or Schandflöte in German, was a metal instrument shaped like a flute or clarinet. But instead of playing it, the accused person was locked into it. Their fingers were clamped into holes, their neck was fastened by a collar, and they were forced to wear it in public. The idea was that the person was a bad musician, usually someone accused of gossip, slander, or just being a nuisance. And so they were punished by literally becoming an instrument of ridicule. Now, did it make music? No, unless you count the sound of villagers laughing at you. But visually, it was striking. Imagine being forced to shuffle around with a giant iron flute strapped to your body, like a bizarre one-person parade. And remember, these communities loved props. Nothing drove the point home like a costume. Speaking of costumes, let's glide over to Italy, where offenders might be forced to wear ridiculous outfits as part of their punishment. A man accused of gossiping or dishonoring his household could be paraded on a donkey, facing backward, holding its tail, because why not double? Down on humiliation, you're not just punished. You're turned into a joke. And yes, women were sometimes forced to wear equally absurd costumes, paper crowns, donkey ears, even masks with exaggerated tongues. The tongue was a favorite symbol. After all, that was the offending organ. 2. Many words, too much wagging tongue. And suddenly, you're being dressed like a human lizard in the town square. What's striking here is how much of this was performance. These punishments weren't private. They weren't quiet. They were staged events with the whole community as the audience. And they weren't about the individual so much as about reinforcing social rules. Everyone else was supposed to learn. Don't step out of line, or this could be you. Now, let's talk a bit more about the scold's bridle, because honestly, it deserves its own sleepy little detour. The bridle wasn't just a cage for the mouth. Sometimes it included extra touches. One version had spikes that pressed into the cheeks if the wearer tried to talk. Another had a little metal plate that forced the tongue down, making speech not only impossible but painful. And then, as if that weren't enough, some versions added those jangly bells I mentioned earlier. Because what's better than humiliation? Humiliation you can hear from down the street. The bridle could be worn for hours, sometimes longer. Imagine trying to swallow, to breathe, to keep your dignity, all while drooling into your own lap with a crowd watching. That was the point, of course, not to reform, but to degrade. And what's extra ironic? Many of the women targeted were widows or single women, people without a male protector, which meant that, essentially, your vulnerability made you fair game. Because gossip wasn't just about words, it was about power. Who got to speak, who didn't, and who had the authority to shut you up. Let's soften the focus now and drift into the everyday reality of gossip itself. What were people even whispering about that could get them strapped into an iron mask or dunked in the river? Well, a lot of it was petty. Accusations of theft, cheating on weights at market, somebody's cow trampling someone else's garden, but also a huge amount of it was sexual. Who was sleeping with whom? Who was neglecting their marital duties? Who might be pregnant out of wedlock? In tiny villages, these things mattered enormously. Reputation was everything. So, gossip was basically the medieval news cycle, and punishing it was, in a way, trying to control the flow of information. Don't believe me? Just look at the overlap with witch trials. A lot of women accused of witchcraft started out being labeled as scolds or gossips. Talking too much made you suspicious, and once you were suspicious, it was a short trip to the stake. Now, let's not get too dramatic. We're keeping things slow and soothing here. But it's worth noting, gossip punishments weren't just about chatter. They were about silencing voices that challenged the community's neat little hierarchy. Let's float gently back to the ducking stool, because there's another layer there too. These dunkings were often public festivals. People sold food, kids cheered, adults jeered, and it all blended into a kind of grim entertainment. Imagine a medieval carnival, but instead of a clown, you get Joan from next door, strapped into a chair and shoved underwater for daring to call the miller lazy. And of course, because humans are endlessly creative, some ducking stools were mobile. They were mounted on wheels so they could be paraded around town before being rolled down to the riverbank. So not only were you soaked and freezing, but you got a scenic tour of your own humiliation first. It's the medieval equivalent of broadcasting your punishment live on Instagram, except, with more mud. One detail that often gets overlooked is that punishments like these didn't just affect the victim. They affected their whole household. If your mother or wife was dunked, your family was shamed too. Neighbors might refuse to trade with you. Landlords might raise your rent, and the stigma could linger for years. Which, again, was the point. Gossip was contagious, and so was its punishment. Now, if all this sounds extreme for something as minor as a few whispered words, well, that's because it was. But remember, in small medieval communities, words carried real weight. A rumor could destroy your reputation, cost you your livelihood, even put you in danger. Without lawyers or HR departments to manage disputes, communities managed it themselves. And they did it loudly, with bells, spikes, rivers, and donkey parades. And here's the ironic part. And let's whisper this part gently, because irony is always best whispered. None of it actually stopped gossip. If anything, it fueled it. The punishments themselves became gossip fodder. Did you see how red she was after the dunking? Did you hear him cry in the shame mask? People lived for that stuff. The community may have officially condemned gossip, but unofficially, it was their favorite pastime. So, the cycle kept spinning. So, we've already walked through the ducking stools, the iron bridles, the noise parades, and the shame flutes. You'd think that would be enough. But no. Medieval communities had a kind of artistic streak when it came to punishments. If humiliation was an art form, then gossipers were their canvas. Let's ease our way into one of the stranger traditions: mock marriages. Picture this. A woman is accused of being too chatty, too quarrelsome, or maybe just unlucky enough to have annoyed the wrong neighbor. Instead of ducking her in a river, the community decides to stage a fake wedding. She's dressed up, sometimes in ridiculous clothes, sometimes with a fake groom, and marched around town like a parody bride. The whole point? To say, this woman is married to her own bad tongue. It's like an early version of performance. Art, except the audience was the village, and the performer had no choice in the matter. People laughed, clapped, and pointed, while the poor woman trudged along, the butt of the joke. And it didn't stop there. Sometimes men got this treatment. 2. A gossiping man, or one accused of being a henpecked husband, could find himself forced into a donkey ride through the streets. Backwards, of course. Because in medieval symbolism, riding backward meant your world was upside down. You'd failed as a man, and the donkey's tail in your hands was just the final punchline. Now, if that feels a little theatrical, well, it was. These punishments weren't just corrections. They were shows. Villagers wanted to be entertained, and humiliation was entertainment. Let's float now toward another particularly odd detail: dead animals. Yes, sometimes offenders were forced to carry the carcasses of animals through the streets as part of their punishment. A dead dog, a pig's head, a goat, whatever the community chose. The symbolism varied. Sometimes the animal was thought to reflect the offender's supposed crime. A gossiping woman might carry a pig's head because pigs were seen as noisy, gluttonous, and dirty, which is frankly not a very flattering comparison. Carrying a stinking, rotting carcass through a crowd of jeering neighbors was basically the medieval version of wearing a sandwich board that says, "Kick me." It marked you physically, made. You smell, and stuck the association in people's minds. Because gossip may have been fleeting, but the image of someone trudging along with a pig's head in their arms, that lasted. And it wasn't just about smell, it was about ritual pollution. In medieval thought, contact with filth marked you as unclean. So, by forcing someone to carry a carcass, they weren't just shaming you in the moment. They were branding you as polluted, tainted, unworthy of trust. From there, let's slide slowly into another favorite community event, riding the stang. Now, the stang wasn't an animal. It was a wooden pole, a long, awkward, heavy log. Offenders were made to ride it, often carried through town on the shoulders of their neighbors while everyone else jeered. Imagine sitting astride a giant beam, bouncing along like a very uncomfortable parade float. That was riding the stang, and, of course, there were chants to go along with it, rhymes mocking the offender, songs reminding everyone of what they'd supposedly done. Because gossip wasn't just punished with silence, it was punished with more gossip. And the chants spread the story further. By the end of the ride, everyone in the village, and probably the next one over, knew exactly what you were accused of. Now, was the stang painful? Probably. But more than that, it was exhausting. Hours of humiliation, carried from place to place, balanced awkwardly, while your community serenaded you with mockery. And like all these punishments, the real wound was to your reputation. Let's slow our pace now and think about reputation, because that was the true currency here. In medieval villages, there were no police, no professional judges most of the time. Justice was communal, and reputation, whether you were trusted, respected, feared, or mocked, determined your survival. Could you get credit at the market? Would neighbors help you repair your roof? Would anyone want to marry into your family? All of that hinged on reputation. So, gossip was powerful, and punishing gossip was equally powerful. By humiliating someone in public, the community was sending a signal. This person is unreliable. Don't listen to them. Let's turn, gently, to another angle of punishment. Ritual shaming through objects. It wasn't always elaborate chairs or iron contraptions. Sometimes it was as simple as forcing someone to carry a heavy stone through town or to wear a wooden collar that labeled them. A wooden board with holes for the neck and hands, like a portable stocks. Imagine shuffling along, unable to scratch your nose, bumping into people while your neighbors jeered, or take the cucking stool, similar to the ducking stool, but stationary. It was basically a chair of shame, placed in a public square, where the offender sat for hours while people mocked, spat, or threw refuse. Think of it like medieval time out, but with rotten vegetables. And remember, these were small communities. You couldn't just fade into anonymity. Everyone knew everyone, which meant that public shaming left deep, lasting scars. Let's meander now into the psychology of it. Because behind the iron masks and donkey rides, there's a clear theme: control. Medieval societies were obsessed with order. Everyone had a place. Lords ruled peasants. Husbands ruled wives. Priests ruled souls. Gossip threatened that neat little pyramid. Why? Because gossip was power. A whispered rumor could bring down a family. A scandal could topple reputations faster than any official decree. So, gossiping wasn't just idle chatter. It was a subversive act, a challenge to authority. And authority responded with creativity, by turning punishment into theater. Ironically, though, these punishments didn't kill gossip. They fed it. Because every bridle, every ducking, every donkey parade became a story in itself. Did you see Margaret's bridal? Did you hear the song they sang about John? The punishments created more chatter than they silenced. Let's drift, almost lazily now, into one last oddity of community justice: banishment. Sometimes, if someone was considered too much of a nuisance, too quarrelsome, too scandalous, too unwilling to shut up, they weren't humiliated. They were simply sent away, driven out of the village, told never to return, which, in a medieval context, was nearly a death sentence. Without community, survival was incredibly hard. But here's the irony, whispered once again. Some people preferred it. For some, banishment was better than wearing the bridle or being dunked in the river. At least in exile, you kept your dignity. So, to recap this gentle wander, medieval punishments for gossip weren't just about silencing words. They were about silencing people. They were about maintaining a fragile social order through theater, ridicule, and fear. And yet, in their very theatricality, they ensured that gossip lived on. So far, we've been hovering over the general landscape of gossip punishments. The bridles, the stools, the stangs, the endless parade of humiliation. But it's time to glide down a little closer. Because yes, we do have records of actual people, with names, dates, and petty little quarrels, who found themselves at the wrong end of these punishments. And honestly, reading them feels like browsing a medieval version of community Facebook drama. Except instead of passive-aggressive comments, the consequences involved iron masks and cold rivers. Let's start in Scotland, because the Scots loved their scolds, bridles. One of the earliest recorded cases dates back to 1567, when a woman in Edinburgh named Bessie Taylor was accused of being a common scold, which basically meant she talked too much, argued too much, or just annoyed someone important. She was sentenced to wear the bridle, a nasty iron cage around her head with a plate that pressed on her tongue. Imagine the humiliation. She's paraded through the town, her head clamped in iron, unable to speak. People pointing, whispering, which, of course, is the cruel irony. She was punished for gossip by becoming gossip. Fast forward to the early 1600s, and you get the case of Catherine Brown in Stirling. Catherine apparently picked fights with her neighbors, insulted them, and spread rumors. The court ordered her into the bridle, and just to make sure the punishment stuck, they chained her to the town cross, the big public monument in the middle of the square. For hours, she stood there, silent, restrained, with everyone walking past her. It's not hard to picture. Children staring, merchants smirking, maybe someone tossing a piece of stale bread. Catherine became living street theater. Now, over in England, the ducking stool took center stage. One famous case comes from the town of Leominster in the 17th century. A woman named Jenny Pipes, yes, that was her actual name, had a reputation for being argumentative. She was strapped into the ducking stool and plunged into the river. We don't know how many times she went under, but the town clerk noted it with a certain satisfaction. She was ducked for scolding. End of entry. That's the thing. The records are so dry. Just a line or two. But behind that line is a soaking, shivering woman dragged out of the river, while her neighbors laughed. And it wasn't just women. Sometimes men were caught in the net, too. In Nottingham, 1634, a man named Richard Blagg was accused of slander. His punishment? Public whipping. So, while the ducking stool was usually reserved for women, men who gossiped or slandered could still find themselves punished, just in more masculine ways. Pain rather than water. Now, if we drift over to Germany, we find the shame flute. Records survive of musicians, or supposed musicians, being forced to wear it when they played badly, or when they gossiped too much. One unlucky fellow, in the city of Ulm in the 1600s, was strapped to the flute for spreading rumors about his guildmaster. He had to stand in the market square, hands locked to the instrument, while people laughed at his performance. And again, irony. The punishment for speaking too much was to be made completely silent. Let's not forget the cucking stools of small English villages. In some cases, they weren't even used for ducking. They were just placed in a public square where the offender sat for hours. In Cambridge, 1581, a woman named Agnes Waterman was sentenced to sit in the cucking stool for unruly tongue. That was the whole crime. Unruly tongue, which really makes you wonder how many of these punishments were actually about silencing dangerous gossip, and how many were just about keeping women quiet. The answer, whispered softly, is probably most of them, because gossip wasn't just idle chatter. It was often women's way of exercising influence. In households where men controlled property, money, and legal authority, gossip was one of the few tools women had. By sharing stories, they could shape reputations, warn each other, spread news. It was a kind of soft power, and authorities hated it. That's why punishments were designed not just to humiliate, but to control, to make examples, to remind the entire village. This is what happens if you talk too much. But, of course, people kept talking anyway. Let's hover gently back to Scotland for one more case. In 1623, a woman named Isabel Young was accused of being a notorious scold, slanderer, and quarreler with her neighbors. The court records are almost exasperated, like they're tired of writing her name down. She was sentenced not just to the bridle, but also to banishment. She had to leave the village entirely. Imagine the loneliness of that. No home, no friends, no market stall to buy bread. Just gone. All for a reputation as a talker. And yet, the fact that her case was recorded means her name lives on, while most of her judges are forgotten, which, in a strange way, feels like a victory. Let's drift a little wider again now, because all these punishments, the bridles, the stools, the flutes, they weren't just about the individuals. They were performances for the crowd, a reminder that gossip could be dangerous, a way of reinforcing the social order through theater, ritual, and humiliation. And, as we've whispered before, the ultimate irony is this. Every punishment became another story, another piece of gossip to be shared, another tale whispered by the fire. So yes, punishments existed. They were harsh, humiliating, and sometimes brutal. But they didn't kill gossip. They fed it. So, by now we've paraded through the worst of it. The iron masks, the riverside dunkings, the endless theater of humiliation. But, as with all fashions, and yes, medieval justice was sometimes more fashion than law, the appetite for these punishments eventually faded. Not quickly, mind you. Medieval and early modern communities had a stubborn streak. Once they got attached to a favorite humiliation, they held on to it for centuries. The ducking stool, for example, lingers in records well into the 18th century. In some English towns, the last documented uses happened in the 1700s. Imagine that Enlightenment philosophers were writing about liberty and reason, while down the road, some poor woman was still being strapped into a chair and dunked into a pond for unruly tongue. But as society inched toward modernization, these punishments began to feel embarrassing, not just for the victims, but for the towns themselves. Cities started wanting to look respectable, orderly, civilized. Publicly dunking people into rivers started to seem a little too medieval, and not in the charming way. By the late 1600s, more cases of gossip or scolding were being handled through fines and warnings instead. Instead of dragging someone into the square, Magistrates just made them pay money or post a bond to guarantee good behavior. Basically, you can keep your mouth, but it's going to cost you. Courts also leaned heavily on public apologies. A classic setup would be the accused stands in the church aisle or at the town hall door, hat off, head bowed, and publicly admits guilt. Sometimes they had to beg forgiveness from the very person they insulted, which, if you think about it, might be worse than ducking. At least the river was over quickly. A public apology lingered in memory. Your neighbors staring, the awkward silence as you muttered, "I was wrong, she was right." Brutal. And then, as the 18th century marched forward, the punishments turned even softer. Clergymen began treating gossip as more of a sin than a crime, something to be handled in the pulpit, with stern sermons about controlling the tongue. Priests scolding scolds, if you like. By the 19th century, most of the old contraptions, the bridles, the stools, the shame flutes, had been carted off to storage or put in curiosity cabinets. Some were melted down. Others ended up in museums. Imagine that. The same device that once crushed a woman's tongue, now sitting behind glass, polished, with a neat little plaque describing its historic function. And yet, even as the objects disappeared, the idea of silencing gossip didn't. It just shifted form. Instead of iron masks, people turned to social exclusion. You might not be paraded in a bridle anymore, but you could still be whispered about, frozen out of community events, or written up in the local paper as troublesome, which, really, was the same thing. Humiliation as control, just without the dripping wet clothes. There's also the fascinating case of how some of these punishments survived as symbols of local heritage. Even today, you'll find towns in England proudly displaying their old ducking stools. Some are set up on the riverbanks, painted neatly, with little plaques. Tourists take photos, children climb on them, everyone giggles. Rarely do people stop to think, right here, a human being was strapped down, terrified, plunged into cold water while their neighbors jeered. History has a way of sanding down sharp edges like that. What was once cruelty becomes quaint, and, in a way, that's the last irony of our sleepy stroll through gossip punishments. The people who suffered them were silenced in their lifetimes, forced underwater, clamped in iron, made to apologize. But centuries later, their punishments have become stories. Little tales to tell tourists or bedtime listeners like you. The bridles, the stools, the flutes, they all survived, but only as curiosities. Meanwhile, the gossip that people tried so hard to suppress never really went away. If anything, it thrived. Because gossip, let's be honest, is one of the most human of all activities. And maybe that's where we should float next. Not to the punishments, but to the gossip itself. What people whispered, why it mattered, and why silencing it was such an obsession. So, after all this talk of bridles and stools and duckings, it's worth asking the simplest question of all. Why did gossip matter so much? Because, really, was it so terrible for one woman to tell another that the baker's loaves were a little smaller this week, or that the miller was skimming flour from the bags? Was it so dangerous for neighbors to speculate about who sneaked into whose cottage after dusk? Apparently, yes. For medieval villages, gossip wasn't just idle chatter. It was information management. There were no newspapers, no bulletin boards, no community Facebook groups. News traveled through mouths and ears, and when mouths were busy, ears got twitchy. Gossip could undermine reputations. It could damage marriages. It could cast doubt on whether a child was legitimate or whether a debt was fairly paid. And in a world where survival depended on trust, sharing tools, sharing food, sharing labor, a tarnished reputation could mean real hardship. So, gossip wasn't harmless background noise. It was power. And power, of course, is what authorities always want to regulate. That's why so many gossip punishments, when you look closely, were about protecting the hierarchy. The wealthy didn't want their reputations shredded in whispers. Clergy didn't want their sermons mocked behind closed doors. Husbands didn't want wives chatting freely about their tempers or affairs. Gossip was dangerous precisely because it was free, informal, and unstoppable. And here's the irony. The more people tried to suppress it, the more it slipped through the cracks. Clamp down one woman in a scold's bridle, and you can bet 5 more were whispering about how cruel it looked. Dunk a wife in the river, and the whole village is suddenly buzzing about who will be next. Gossip was like water itself. Try to hold it too tightly, and it simply seeps through your fingers. Now, if you float forward a few centuries, you'll notice not much has changed. We may not strap people into bridles anymore, but reputations are still fragile things. Gossip still circles, only now it's digital. Instead of whispers by the well, it's comment threads under a post. Instead of nods over the fence, it's subtweets or anonymous reviews. And still, people get punished for it. Not by ducking stools, but by online shaming, canceled reputations, viral call-outs. It's the same old dance, just with faster shoes. But here's the sleepy comfort. Gossip isn't going anywhere. It's stitched into human life. People will always talk. Sometimes it's petty, sometimes it's cruel, sometimes it's oddly tender. But it's part of how communities make sense of themselves. And maybe, if we look back at those rusted bridles and rotten stools with a bit of distance, we can see how far we've come. The tools of punishment are mostly gone. What remains is the chatter itself. Sometimes irritating, sometimes silly, but rarely worth drowning anyone over. So tonight, as you drift down into your own quiet sleep, imagine all those medieval villagers, whispering under their breath, glancing over their shoulders, sharing stories in the dark. Imagine how many punishments were invented to try to silence them, and how none of it really worked, because gossip survived. The punishments faded. And in the end, it's the stories, not the bridles, that reach us now. And with that, I'll let the whispers fade out. You can close your eyes, sink into your pillow, and rest easy, knowing that no one's waiting outside with a ducking stool. Good night.